Hi, is this the police? I would like to report a murder. Actually, some murders. Every single Italian name in this video. And I'm the culprit. A young couple on a moonless night in a local lover's lane in the 1960s. In the darkness of a new moon, a monster creeps up and opens fire on them. The monster then retreats, leaving death in his wake. As daylight dawns, their families learn the terrible news that two young people will never be coming home. Sound familiar? If you're a true crime aficionado, you probably immediately recognize the scene, and you thought, he's going to talk about the Zodiac killer. But our case actually opens over 6,000 miles away from California, in the beautiful Tuscan hills of Italy, with the first victims actually predating the infamous Zodiac by several months. In the 1960s through 80s, the romantic hills of Florence turned into hunting grounds for a predator. The monster of Florence didn't just take lives. He stole the sense of safety from an entire community. Young people in love, doing what many of us have done, driving out to secluded spots for privacy, would become targets of unspeakable horror. At various points, police thought they caught the killer, only to realize he was still out there, free to kill again. For the families of the 16 victims, the nightmare didn't end with the murders. It continued in decades of uncertainty and painful questions, with no clear answers. How did this mystery begin? Why has it been so difficult to solve? Well, to understand that, we need to go back to a summer night in 1968, when what seemed like a simple crime of passion unleashed a horror that would span for 17 years. It started on August 21st, 1968, in the outskirts of Florence. That night, 29-year-old mason worker Antonio Lobianco and 32-year-old homemaker Barbara Lotti parked a white Alfa Romeo in a quiet lane in the small town of Signa. Barbara's 6-year-old son was asleep in the back seat as the couple sought a private moment together. But in the darkness, someone approached their car. Gunshots rang out, hitting both Antonio and Barbara. When Natalino, Barbara's son, woke up, he found a scene of terror. His mother and Antonio were dead in the front seat. Terrified, the young boy ran from the car through the night until he reached a nearby house for help. When the Carabinieri, Italy's national police force, arrived, they found a grim scene. The double murder shocked the local community, but initially did not hint at a serial killer. Police quickly honed in on a suspect who seemed to have a clear motive: Stefano Mele, Barbara Lotti's husband. Barbara had a bit of a reputation in town. She was called the Queen Bee for her active social and love life. And Stefano, her husband, was a bit older than her. Investigators learned Barbara was unfaithful to him, and Stefano Mele, under interrogation, would eventually confess to killing his wife and her lover, apparently out of jealousy. Some reports, though, suggest that interrogation at the hands of the Italian police at that time might not have come without coercion. Regardless, in 1970, Stefano Mele was convicted of the murders and sent to prison, seemingly closing the case. For a while, it appeared to be an open and shut crime of passion. A husband eliminated his unfaithful wife and her partner. A tragic but not unheard of story. Yet it had only just begun. Over the next few years, new murders would occur. Murders uncannily similar to the 1968 case. Each time, the shadow of doubt grew. Did the police get the wrong man in 1968? Could the real killer still be free? These questions would resurface with vengeance when another young couple was found dead in 1974, in circumstances far too familiar to ignore. On September 15, 1974, in the countryside near Borgo San Lorenzo, another town in the province of Florence, two young people, 18-year-old Stefania Pettini and 24-year-old Pasquale Gentilcore, were found dead in Pasquale's Fiat 127. They'd been shot and killed while parked in a rural spot. The scene that greeted investigators was one of almost unimaginable brutality. Pasquale had been shot 3 times, but the killer's true rage was reserved for Stefania. Her body was dragged out of the car. She'd been stabbed 97 times. In a final horrifying act of desecration, the killer used a knife to mutilate her body, then inserted a grapevine stalk into her wounds. The crime was so savage, so different from the 1968 shooting, that police at first saw no connection. It seemed to be the work of a frenzied, disorganized madman. This was no simple crime of passion or robbery gone wrong. It felt like the work of a predator who derived pleasure from terror and mutilation. Police began questioning family members. It turns out that Stefania had actually expressed fear before that night. She told a friend about a weird man who'd been following and frightening her days earlier. Another friend recalled a stranger stalking them during a driving lesson not long before the murder. These reports hinted that the killer might have been watching his victims, possibly stalking and selecting targets. Indeed, investigators later learned that the area where Pasquale and Stefania parked was known to attract voyeurs, people who spied on couples. And some witnesses mentioned an odd pair of voyeurs acting strangely there. It's chilling to imagine. The monster might have literally been lurking in the bushes, watching couples in intimate moments, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By now, one thing was clear. Stefano Mele, the jailed husband from the 1968 case, could not have committed this 1974 double murder. He was behind bars when Pasquale and Stefania were killed. So this raised a disturbing possibility. Maybe the same killer was responsible for both incidents, meaning the wrong man might have been convicted back in 1968. In 1974, though, authorities didn't conclusively link the cases. The term monster of Florence hadn't been coined yet, and serial killers weren't yet part of the Italian vocabulary in the way they are now. Some investigators likely wondered if it was a coincidence or a copycat. The MO, secluded couple, .22 caliber gun, unique Winchester bullets, and vicious mutilation of the female victim set a pattern that would tragically repeat again and again. Young couples continued to venture into the countryside for privacy, not fully realizing a killer could be in their midst. That would change in the 1980s when the monster spree intensified. In the summer of 1981, the killer resurfaced with a vengeance, shattering any illusion that 1974 was an isolated incident. Florence was about to learn it had a serial killer on its hands. 1981 would be the turning point. The terror that struck in 1968 and 1974 returned, and this time it hit repeatedly. On June 6, 1981, an engaged couple, Giovanni Foggi, 31, and Carmela Denuccio, 21, were found brutally killed near Scandicci, a town just outside Florence. After the shooting, the killer dragged Carmela's body a short distance away. The next morning, an eerie twist added to the suspense. A local paramedic named Enzo Spalletti, known as a voyeur in the area, started gossiping about the murder, before the bodies had even been officially discovered. Spalletti's premature knowledge made police suspect he could be the murderer, or at least an accomplice. He was arrested and jailed for a few months, but he would later be exonerated in a grim way. The real monster struck again, while Spalletti was behind bars, proving the killer was still at large. The next attack came swiftly. On October 23, 1981, just 4 months later, another couple, Stefano Baldi, 26, and Susanna Cambi, 24, who were recently engaged to be married, were found dead in a park near Calanzano. The pattern was undeniable now. Florence had a serial killer who was targeting couples, and an even creepier detail emerged. Susanna Cambi had told her mother shortly before that murder that someone was stalking and following her. The morning after her death, Susanna's mother received an anonymous phone call. The unknown caller cruelly said he wanted to talk to her about her daughter, a chilling taunt to the grieving family. Whether that caller was the monster himself or some twisted prankster isn't confirmed, but it deepened the atmosphere of dread. As the body count rose, a palpable sense of fear gripped the province of Florence. This wasn't something that was supposed to happen in Italy. Serial killers were seen as a grim American phenomenon. Italy was too civilized for such horrors. But the monster of Florence was shattering that illusion. The cultural impact was profound. In the conservative Italy of the 1970s and 80s, where many people lived with their parents until marriage, the car was the only place a couple could find privacy. The rolling hills of Tuscany weren't just scenic spots. They were a social necessity, a place for courtship and romance. The monster was turning these sanctuaries into slaughterhouses. And the media frenzy was intense. Newspapers splashed lurid headlines across their front pages, with journalist Mario Spezzi coining the name Il Mostro di Firenze. Police issued public warnings and distributed flyers, urging couples not to park in isolated areas. The fear was so widespread that it was said to have fundamentally altered the social habits of an entire generation. A cloud of paranoia and suspicion descended on the region. Anyone with a grudge could point a finger, and police were inundated with false leads. Florence, once the cradle of the Renaissance, was becoming a city of fear. In response, police formed a special task force known as the Anti-Monster Squad to hunt the killer. They looked back at the past crimes, the 1974 Gentilcore Patini murder was re-examined, and two clear signatures came to light. The first was the gun. It was a .22 caliber Beretta Series 70 pistol. But what made it unique was the ammunition. In every single murder, from 1968 to 1985, the killer used the same type of bullets. Winchester brand, with a distinctive letter H stamped on the bottom of the cartridge case. That was the smoking gun, literally connecting the crimes. Investigators now knew for certain that a single serial killer was operating around Florence. On June 19th of 1982, he struck again, in an area near Montespertoli. Paolo Mainardi, 22, a mechanic, and his fiancée Antonella Migliorini, 20, had parked alongside the roadside. The monster attacked, shooting them in their car. But this time something went differently. The location was less isolated than usual, and a few passing motorists actually saw Paolo's car parked with its interior light on around the time of the attack. Possibly startling the killer, he left without mutilating Antonella like the other women. In the chaos, Paolo attempted to escape. His Fiat ended up crashing into a ditch a short distance away. When help finally arrived, an astonishing discovery was made. Paolo Mainardi was still alive. He had bullet wounds and was gravely injured, but he hadn't died yet. It was a spark of hope, perhaps the only time authorities had a living witness who might identify the monster. Paolo was rushed to the hospital. Unfortunately, though, he succumbed to his injuries a few hours later without being able to provide any useful description of the attacker. Despite Paolo's death, the police tried a clever trick. They leaked false information to the press, claiming that Paolo had briefly regained consciousness and named his attacker before dying. This was a ruse. In truth, Paolo never spoke. But detectives hoped the monster might panic, thinking he'd been identified, or that someone with knowledge of the 1968 murder might come forward. Their gamble paid off, indirectly. Soon after, an anonymous tip reached police, urging them to re-examine the 1968 killing of Lotti and Lobianco. The tip, from someone calling himself a friend of the citizens, insisted the first case held the key. Investigators dug out the old 1968 case file and were stunned. Stored inside were unused cartridges and shell casings that had inexplicably been sitting in the file for years. They were .22 caliber rounds, and tests showed that they matched the monster's gun. It was now clear that Stefano Mele didn't act alone in 1968, if he'd even acted at all. As fear peaked in the early 1980s, pressure on police to catch the monster was immense. Following the hint to revisit the 1968 case, detectives focused on people in Barbara Lotti's circle, many of whom were Sardinian immigrants, like Barbara herself and her husband Stefano. This became the Sardinian trail in the investigation. Mele's story had changed multiple times. He had at various points accused different men, often fellow Sardinians, of being the real culprit in 1968. So investigators started rounding up these individuals, hoping one of them was the monster. The first was Francesco Vinci, one of Barbara Lotti's former lovers. Francesco had a checkered past and a potential motive of jealousy. Significantly, around the time police faked the news of Mainardi waking up, Francesco Vinci mysteriously hit his car, raising suspicions that he thought he might have been incriminated. The authorities would arrest him in 1982, and he was still in custody in 1983 when, incredibly, another double murder occurred. Since the monster kept killing while Francesco Vinci sat in jail, he was eventually released, because he couldn't be the monster. Next, investigators widened the net. In 1983, Giovanni Mele, Stefano's brother, and Piero Mucciarini, Stefano's brother-in-law, were arrested. It was thought that perhaps they might have helped Stefano commit the 1968 murders, and those accomplices continued their crimes in the 1970s and 80s. But this theory would also collapse. By 1984, while Giovanni and Piero were in custody, another monster killing took place. So the true killer was thumbing his nose at investigators. Whenever they thought they'd caught him, he'd strike again to prove them wrong. Giovanni Mele and Piero Mucciarini were released as well. Investigators then turned their gaze to Salvatore Vinci, Francesco's brother. Salvatore had also been involved with Barbara Lotти. In fact, Barbara had so many entanglements that this case sometimes read like a dark, tangled soap opera. Salvatore was interesting to police not only for the Lotti connection, but also because his first wife had died under suspicious circumstances in Sardinia. Back in 1960, she was found in her bedroom having succumbed to gas fumes. At the time, her death was assumed to have been self-arranged. But investigators started to think, well, maybe Salvatore had a hand in the death. So in 1985, shortly after the last known monster killing, Salvatore Vinci was arrested and charged with his wife's death. It was hoped that evidence would be found in his home that could tie him to the Florence murders. However, Salvatore was acquitted of his wife's murder, and nothing was found that tied him to the monster. By 1989, the whole Sardinian trail fizzled out. Meanwhile, the monster continued his bloody work through 1984 and 1985. On September 9th of 1983, an unusual double homicide challenged the investigators' assumptions. Two young tourists from West Germany, Wilhelm Friedrich Horst Meyer and Jens Uwe Rusch, both 24, were traveling through Italy to celebrate a scholarship Meyer had won. They weren't a traditional couple. They were just two male friends camping on a Volkswagen Samba near Galuzzo. Some reports suggest they could have been romantic partners, but that's not confirmed. That night, both Meyer and Rusch were shot to death in their van with the now infamous .22 Beretta. So if these two weren't an obvious male-female couple, why did the monster target them? Well, one likely explanation is that Jens Rusch had long blonde hair and a slender build, so the killer could have mistaken him for a woman at first glance in the dark. And by the time the monster realized his error, the deed was done. In any case, this was the only instance where no female victim was present to mutilate, which thwarted the killer's unusual ritual. It hinted at the possibility that the monster was specifically targeting women, and that their male partners were just collateral victims, because the mutilations were always directed at the women. Regardless, the case reinforced that nowhere, not even a vacation van, was safe for couples. On July 29th of '84, the monster murdered another pair of local sweethearts, Claudio Stefanici, 21, a law student, and Pia Gilda Rontini, 18, a bartender. They were in Claudio's small Fiat Panda in a wooded area near Viccio, northeast of Florence. Similar to before, the killer shot the pair and then stabbed and savaged Pia's body. This was a gruesome escalation. The horror and anger in the community grew even stronger, if that was even possible. After some investigation, it was revealed that Pia had mentioned to friends that an unpleasant man was bothering her at the bar where she worked, and that a strange man might have followed the couple to an ice cream shop earlier that day. Florence in 1984 felt like they were stalked by an invisible menace. Anyone might have seen the monster without even knowing it. Finally, the last known attack attributed to the monster came on the night of September 7th, 1985. It targeted Jean-Michel Kravitchvili, 25, and Nadine Moirot, 36, a French couple on vacation camping in the Tuscan countryside. They'd pitched a small tent in a forest in Scopetti, not far from San Casciano. The killer silently approached as they slept, shooting Nadine in the tent and wounding Jean-Michel, who managed to tear out of the tent and run. But the monster chased him down and stabbed him to death a short distance away. Then the killer performed his grotesque mutilations. What he did next was a brazen taunt to authorities. A few days after the murders, Florence prosecutor Silvia Della Monica received an envelope in the mail containing a note along with a piece of human breast tissue. The note essentially alerted the authorities that a new murder had occurred and challenged them to find the bodies. But by the time the letter arrived on the prosecutor's desk, a mushroom forager had already stumbled upon the gruesome crime scene in the woods, and police were already beginning their investigation of the site. It was as if the monster couldn't resist gloating, or maybe he just wanted to increase the terror of the community. With 8 double homicides over 17 years, the monster of Florence became Italy's most notorious serial killer. 16 lives were brutally snuffed out. The toll on the community was profound. Ordinary life was warped by fear and suspicion. An entire region's youth had grown up under the shadow of the monster. But even though the murders ceased, the investigation was far from over. In fact, the late 1980s and early 1990s would see a dramatic pivot in the hunt. With no new murders after 1985, investigators finally had time to regroup. The Sardinian suspects were cleared. So by the late 1980s, police almost had to start from scratch and used early computer databases to cross-check known violent or sexual offenders against the monster's timeline. Their search soon focused on someone close to home, Pietro Pacciani, a Tuscan farmer with a disturbingly violent history. Pacciani, an illiterate laborer from Mercatale, seemed an unremarkable peasant until you looked at his past. In 1951, as a teenager, he caught his fiancée with another man, and in a jealous rage, stabbed the rival 19 times and allegedly violated the corpse with a farm tool. The brutality echoed the 1968 killing of Barbara Locci and her lover. He served 13 years for that murder, but his violence continued. He beat his wife and essayed his 2 daughters, crimes for which he was again convicted. Police Inspector Ruggero Perugini, head of the Monster Task Force, became convinced this history fit the profile of a serial killer who despised women. Searches of Pacciani's property turned up some troubling items. A painting resembling Botticelli's Primavera, which was notable for its depiction of the goddess Flora with a breast exposed, along with another image with disturbing motifs. Investigators saw unsettling parallels between this imagery and the monster's post-mortem mutilations. And more compelling, after days of combing his garden, police found a .22 Winchester cartridge, the same caliber used in every monster killing. To many it looked like a smoking gun, but the discovery was suspicious. Accounts differ on whether the round was spent or live, and whispers soon spread it might have been planted. In January of '93, Pacciani was arrested. His trial in 1994 became a national spectacle, broadcast across all of Italy. Prosecutors portrayed him as a hulking, violent peasant, nicknamed Il Vampa, the Spark, for his temper, who harbored a boiling hatred of women. They leaned heavily on his past crimes, and on that single bullet. In 1994, he was convicted of 7 of the 8 double murders, all except for the already adjudicated 1968 case, and he was sentenced to 1 life term for each pair of victims. Tuscany briefly exhaled. The monster seemed to have been unmasked. But the relief was short-lived. Pacciani maintained his innocence, and critics noted the evidence was almost entirely circumstantial. There was no DNA, there weren't any fingerprints, and there were no witnesses who placed him at any of the crime scenes. Even the Attorney General of the Florence Appeals Court argued in 1996 that the conviction should be thrown out for lack of proof and investigative missteps. In a dramatic reversal, Pacciani's life sentence was overturned. Italy's Court of Cassation ordered a retrial, but before it began, Pacciani died of a heart attack in '98 at 73. Technically, a free man, still insisting he wasn't the monster. While Pacciani had awaited retrial, prosecutors advanced a new theory. He didn't act alone. They accused a ragtag circle of drinking companions from San Casciano of sharing in the murders. Chief among them were retired postman Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti, a simple-minded drifter in his 50s. The nickname that stuck came straight from Vanni himself. Testifying at Pacciani's first trial, he insisted that he and Pacciani were merely compagnie di merende, snack buddies, who drank wine and shared food. The press seized on the phrase, darkly branding the alleged killers the snack buddies. After Pacciani's acquittal, Lotti came under pressure from a new task force chief, Michele Giudiari. His story shifted across interrogations. First, he claimed he merely witnessed the 1985 murder of the French couple, then admitting participation and naming both Pacciani and Vanni as the shooters. Lotti even hinted at a mysterious doctor figure. Another acquaintance, Fernando Pucci, cognitively impaired and an unreliable witness, also gave a partial corroboration. Despite the absence of physical evidence, authorities felt they finally had a case. Between '97 and '98, Vanni and Lotti were tried for several monster murders. A fourth man, Giovanni Faggi, was accused of supplying the gun, but acquitted. The prosecution relied almost entirely on Lotti's confessions and Pucci's shaky support. In '98, Vanni was convicted of 5 double murders and sentenced to life. Lotti received 30 years, which would later be reduced to 26 for 4. Italy's Supreme Court upheld the verdicts in 2000. Yet the outcome convinced few skeptics. Lotti's motives shifted wildly. At one point, he claimed the trio killed couples after women spurned their advances. Another time, he alleged that Pacciani fed excised body parts to his daughters in twisted rituals. No single motive emerged. There weren't fingerprints or DNA or a murder weapon that tied any of the men to the crimes. All 3 were already middle-aged when the killings occurred, hardly typical profiles for stealthy serial murders. Many suspected that the authorities were desperate to close the case, so they fixed on easy targets. Prosecutors themselves never claimed every murder was solved, and even victims' lawyers voiced doubts. As attorney Walter Biscotti later said, none of the trials so far have gotten to the whole truth. Vanni died in 2009 and Lotti in 2021, both still officially branded as monster accomplices. But to this day, many investigators and journalists believe the true killer, or killers, were never caught. The case was about to grow a little stranger. In the early 2000s, Giudice and public prosecutor Giuliano Minini, later known for the Amanda Knox case, pushed a sensational theory. The monster killings were commissioned by a Tuscan satanic cult that paid Pacciani and his friends to harvest female body parts. Lotti had mentioned a doctor who ordered the murders. Investigators pointed to odd details. Pacciani's books on black magic, a pyramid-shaped stone at a villa where he once worked, and the fact that despite his humble trade, Pacciani had mysteriously large savings, about 157 million lira, which was over 117,000 euros in 1996. To Gittari and Mignini, this hinted at payment for ritual killings. Skeptics would counter that Pacciani was frugal and did odd jobs. The money could have mundane explanations. The cult theory brought new suspects. Pharmacist Francesco Calamandre and Dr. Francesco Narducci, a Peruvian surgeon who drowned in 1985. Mignini suspected Narducci had been murdered by fellow cultists to silence him, and even suggested a body swap conspiracy when Narducci's corpse was exhumed and found with signs of possible strangulation, claims that later DNA testing would disprove. Calamandre's villa was searched in 2001 for hidden ritual chambers, and nothing was found. Tried in 2004, he was acquitted in 2008 due to lack of evidence. By then, the satanic sect theory was widely seen as prosecutorial overreach. Journalist Mario Spezzi and American writer Douglas Preston, researching the case for the book The Monster of Florence, publicly challenged the cult narrative. The response was chilling. Their phones were tapped. Preston was interrogated for hours and warned to leave Italy, and Spezzi was arrested and even accused of involvement in the murders before all charges would collapse. The investigation had turned inward, targeting its critics, as if defending its own mythology. By the mid-2000s, the case was a maze of conflicting theories. Officially, Vanni and Lotti remained convicted, but many believed the real killer had never been identified. Spezzi and Preston revisited the first 1968 murder, noting that police had once suspected that Stefano Mele had helped obtaining the gun and hiding it afterward. Mele had named brothers Francesco and Salvatore Vinci, early suspects who were later cleared when murders continued during their imprisonment, so Preston and Spezzi theorized that maybe one of them had hidden the gun after Mele shot his wife. The two journalists became intrigued by Salvatore's son, Antonio Vinci. In 1974, when he was 14, Antonio broke into a locked room in his father's house, stole something, and ran away. The writers wonder in their book if the stolen item could have been the hidden .22 Beretta, because only 4 months later, while Antonio was still a runaway, a double murder occurred with the same weapon. The murder in 1974 was also the first in which the female victim's body was stabbed after death, a marked difference from the Lotti murder. Antonio returned home later that year, remaining there until 1980. That year he moved in with his uncle Francesco in Tuscany, just as the murders resumed. The FBI's behavioral profile, which they would share with the Italian authorities, described a solitary, organized killer with above-average intelligence and a troubled past, a description that fit Antonio much better than the hapless snack buddies. When Spezzi confronted Antonio during an interview, the young man would reply chillingly, "I like women alive." Still, there is no hard evidence that ties Antonio Vinci to the crimes. Another modern suspect is Giampiero Vigilanti, a former soldier and old friend of Pacciani's. Police once found monster-related newspaper clippings and .22 caliber bullets in his home. He was never charged, but as recently as 2021, victims' families have urged renewed DNA testing, particularly of an unidentified male sample from the 1985 anonymous letter containing the victim's breast, which didn't match Pacciani or any of the convicted men. Thus, even 40 years after the last murder, the Monster of Florence case continues to cast a long shadow. It's a case that doesn't have a satisfying resolution. It remains, as one article in The Guardian put it, one of Italy's darkest unsolved mysteries. Now, do you recall how I mentioned at the beginning of the video that there was some similarity to the Zodiac killer? Well, online there is fringe speculation that the Zodiac killer moved to Florence and is the culprit behind these crimes. Personally, I don't see that because the Zodiac crimes happened after the 1968 murder in Florence, but then before the rest of the Florence murders. And it seems odd to me that he would have traveled from America to Italy to commit the first murder, then return back to America for a murder spree, and then later back to Italy again. Moreover, the Zodiac was known to taunt police and the media with his cryptograms, and while the monster did send that one letter, it just didn't have enough similarity to the Zodiac letters. What do you guys think? Feel free to drop your thoughts in the comments. Decades have passed. Thousands of people were investigated. A series of chaotic trials have come and gone, but the fundamental questions are unanswered. Who was the man who stalked the hills of Tuscany, stealing the future from 16 innocent people? Was it a lone maniac? a crude farmer, or an instrument of a darker conspiracy? I hope for the sake of the families that it will soon be solved for good, and that the shadow that has hung over the beautiful hills of Florence will be lifted once and for all. If you believe we've earned it, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. As a small channel, viewers like you truly do make a massive difference in us getting discovered. Thank you. I'll see you in the next video.